They called me too old at my grandson's birthday, so I showed them the college fund I'd been building. When you've spent 73 years on this earth, you learn that age isn't about the wrinkles on your face or the slowness in your step. It's about the wisdom you've gathered and the patience you've mastered. What my daughter-in-law Jessica and son Marcus didn't realize when they humiliated me at little Tommy's 7th birthday party was that this old woman had been playing chess while they were still learning checkers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Sullivan, though most folks around Millbrook have called me Dot for the better part of 5 decades. I've lived in the same modest 2-story house on Maple Street since 1978, the year my late husband Frank bought it for us with his savings from working double shifts at the steel mill. The house isn't much to look at from the outside. Faded blue shutters, a front porch that creaks when you step on the 3rd board, and a mailbox that leans slightly to the left after the Henderson boy crashed his bicycle into it 3 summers. Ego. But it's been my sanctuary, my fortress, and lately my strategic headquarters. People see a 73-year-old widow with silver hair that I keep in a neat bun and assume I'm just another lonely grandmother counting down her days. They notice the reading glasses hanging from a chain around my neck, the sensible shoes I wear for my daily walks, and the way I sometimes pause to catch my breath when climbing stairs. What they don't see is the sharp mind that's been quietly observing, calculating, and planning for months. The morning of Tommy's birthday party started like any other Saturday. I woke at 5:30, a habit from my working days when I managed the accounting department at Morrison Manufacturing for 37 years. Even in retirement, my internal clock refuses to adjust. I made my usual breakfast of oatmeal with fresh blueberries from my garden, checked the morning stock reports on my tablet, a gift Tommy insisted I needed last Christmas, and reviewed my investment portfolio while sipping black coffee from Frank's old mug. Most people my age stick their money in savings accounts earning pennies, but I've always believed in making money work harder than that. After Frank passed 8 years ago, I threw myself into learning about investments with the same dedication I once applied to keeping Morrison's books balanced. I studied market trends, read financial journals, and even took an online course on portfolio management, much to the amusement of my neighbor Mrs. Chen, who thought it was adorable that I was playing with computers at my age. The birthday party was scheduled for 2 o'clock at Riverside Park, the same place we'd celebrated Tommy's last 3 birthdays. I'd spent the morning wrapping his present, a junior geology kit he'd been eyeing at the Science Museum during our last visit together, and preparing homemade sugar cookies shaped like dinosaurs, his current obsession. I'd learned to make them from scratch after watching countless YouTube tutorials, another skill that apparently made me charmingly old-fashioned in Jessica's eyes. I arrived at the park 15 minutes early, as is my habit, carrying a covered dish of cookies and Tommy's gift in a carefully chosen gift bag featuring his favorite T-Rex. The pavilion was already bustling with activity. Jessica had outdone herself with decorations, balloons in Tommy's favorite green and orange colors, a professional banner declaring Tommy's Jurassic Adventure, and tables laden with catered food that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Marcus was manning the grill, wearing an apron that read Dino Dad, and looking every inch the successful real estate agent he'd become. At 38, he had the kind of confidence that came from closing million-dollar deals and driving a BMW he replaced every 2 years. He'd inherited his father's height and my stubborn streak, though he'd somehow missed out on Frank's humility and my sense of fiscal responsibility. Jessica stood near the gift table, arranging packages with the precision of someone who'd missed her calling as an event planner. At 35, she was undeniably beautiful, the kind of polished perfection that came from regular salon appointments, yoga classes, and a wardrobe that cost more than most people's car payments. Her honey blonde hair was styled in loose waves, her makeup was camera-ready despite the outdoor setting, and her designer sundress probably cost more than I spent on clothing in a year. Tommy spotted me first, as he always did. My grandson had Frank's dark hair and my green eyes, along with an infectious enthusiasm for life that reminded me of Marcus at that age, before somewhere along the way he'd learned to measure everything by its price tag. "Grandma Dot!" Tommy launched himself at me with the kind of uninhibited joy that made every moment of grandmotherhood worthwhile. "Did you bring cookies? Please tell me you brought the dinosaur ones." I hugged him close, breathing in the scent of grass stains and childhood innocence that clung to him. "Of course I did, sweetheart. They're in the blue container on the table." "You're the best!" He bounded away toward the food table, leaving me standing alone as other guests began to arrive. The party was everything a 7-year-old could want: games, prizes, a magician who made balloon animals, and enough sugar to power a small city. I found myself relegated to a folding chair on the periphery, watching as Jessica's friends and Marcus's colleagues filled the space with animated conversations about property values, vacation destinations I'd never see, and private schools I'd never afford. I didn't mind being on the sidelines. At my age, you learn to find contentment in simple pleasures, watching Tommy's face light up as he opened each gift, seeing him laugh until his sides hurt at the magician's silly jokes, witnessing the pure joy of childhood that seemed increasingly rare in a world that demanded children grow up too fast. It was during the gift-opening ceremony that the first crack appeared in what I thought was a peaceful family gathering. Tommy had just finished unwrapping a remote-controlled dinosaur from Jessica's sister when he reached for my carefully wrapped geology kit. "Oh, that's from Grandma Dot," Jessica announced loudly enough for several nearby parents to hear. Her tone carried a subtle note I'd heard before but never quite acknowledged, a dismissive undertone that suggested my gift was somehow lesser, quaint in the way antiques are quaint, but ultimately impractical. Tommy tore through the wrapping, paper with enthusiasm, his eyes widening when he saw the geology kit inside. "Wow, look at all these rocks, and a magnifying glass, and what's this?" He held up a small hammer designed for cracking open geodes. "It's for exploring rocks and minerals," I explained, moving closer to show him the included guidebook. "Remember when we found those interesting stones by the creek? This kit will help you identify them and maybe find some crystals hidden inside regular-looking rocks." "That's so cool!" Tommy's excitement was genuine and infectious. Several other children crowded around to examine the kit, their interest piqued by the promise of hidden treasures. That's when Jessica's voice cut through the children's chatter, like a blade through silk. "Marcus, look at this. Your mother bought him rocks and a hammer." She laughed, but it wasn't the warm, inclusive laugh of someone sharing a joke. It was the kind of laugh that made you feel like you were the punchline. Marcus glanced over from where he was serving cake, taking in the scene with a quick assessment. "Oh, Mom, you didn't need to spend money on..." "Well, it's thoughtful, but kids his age are more into electronics now. Video games, tablets, that sort of thing." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I felt heat rise to my cheeks, but I kept my voice steady. Tommy asked about rocks the last time we visited the Science Museum. I thought he might enjoy learning about geology. "That's sweet, Dot," Jessica said, her tone dripping with condescension. "But you have to understand, Tommy's at an age where he needs educational toys that prepare him for the real world. Science kits are nice and all, but he needs to develop technological literacy, problem-solving skills, things that will actually benefit his future." One of Jessica's friends, a woman named Brenda, who always spoke a little too loudly and wore jewelry that announced her presence before she entered a room, decided to join the conversation. "Oh, isn't that adorable? My grandmother used to give us the most random gifts. She once gave my daughter a set of embroidery hoops. Can you imagine? Like we live in the 1950s? The women around Jessica laughed appreciatively, and I watched as my gift, chosen with love and careful consideration of my grandson's interests, became the amusing anecdote that would probably be repeated at their next book club meeting or tennis lesson. But it was Marcus's next words that cut the deepest. "You know how it is with older people," he said, his voice carrying just far enough for me to hear clearly. "They lose touch with what kids actually want. Mom still thinks the way she thought when I was little, but the world's moved on. Tommy needs to stay current, not play with rocks like some kind of caveman." The group laughed again, and I felt something inside me wither. Not because they were laughing at my gift, but because my own son was leading the charge. This was the boy I'd raised alone after Frank died when Marcus was 15. The teenager I'd worked overtime to support through college, sacrificing my own comfort so he could graduate debt-free. The young man I'd helped with his first house down payment, his wedding expenses, and countless other financial emergencies over the years. I stayed for the rest of the party because leaving would have disappointed Tommy, and my feelings mattered less than his happiness. I helped clean up, washing dishes and folding chairs while Jessica's friends continued their conversations about interior designers and European vacations. I kissed Tommy goodbye, promising to see him soon, and drove home in my 15-year-old Honda Civic while processing what had just happened. It wasn't the first time I'd felt dismissed by Marcus and Jessica, but it was the first time it had been so public, so deliberately cruel. As I pulled into my driveway and sat in the gathering dusk, I realized that what hurt most wasn't their opinion of my gift. It was the realization that they saw me as irrelevant, outdated, a relic to be tolerated rather than a person to be respected. That night, I sat in Frank's old recliner with a cup of tea and really thought about my relationship with my son and daughter-in-law. Over the past few years, I'd noticed subtle changes in how they treated me. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Decisions about Tommy's life made without consulting me, despite my being his only surviving grandparent. Casual comments about retirement homes and downsizing that seemed to come up more frequently. I'd attributed it to the natural evolution of families, the way children grow up and create their own lives. I'd told myself that Marcus was busy with work, that Jessica was stressed with motherhood, that they didn't mean to make me feel excluded. But sitting alone in my living room, surrounded by 45 years of memories, I had to confront an uncomfortable truth. They weren't just growing distant. They were actively pushing me away. And based on some comments I'd overheard but dismissed, I was beginning to suspect their motivations went beyond simple embarrassment about having an old-fashioned mother. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of calling Marcus to thank him for the lovely party, as I usually would, I decided to do some investigating. If my son and daughter-in-law thought I was just a doddering old woman they could dismiss and manipulate, it was time to show them exactly how sharp this old mind still was. I started with something simple, reviewing our recent interactions. With fresh eyes, looking for patterns I'd previously missed or excused. What I found was disturbing enough to warrant deeper investigation, and what I discovered over the next few weeks would prove that my suspicions were not only justified, but far worse than I'd imagined. The geology kit incident had been the catalyst, but it wasn't the real problem. The real problem was what my son and daughter-in-law had been planning behind my back, and why they were suddenly so interested in my living situation, my finances, and my future plans. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me had silver hair and lined skin, but her eyes were sharp and determined. If Marcus and Jessica thought they could dismiss Dorothy Sullivan as irrelevant, they were about to learn just how much they'd underestimated their opponent. The game was about to begin, and they had no idea I was already 3 moves ahead. The investigation began innocently enough. I started by organizing my financial records, something I did quarterly anyway as a matter of habit from my accounting days. But this time, I wasn't just looking at my own statements. I was looking for patterns in how Marcus and Jessica interacted with my money, my property, and my life decisions. What I found made my blood run cold. Over the past 18 months, There had been a steady escalation in their interest in my finances. It started small, Marcus asking casual questions about my retirement savings during Sunday dinners, Jessica making offhand comments about how expensive home maintenance must be for someone on a fixed income, suggestions that I might be happier in a smaller place, somewhere with less upkeep and more social opportunities. I pulled out my desk calendar and traced back through the months, marking each incident with a red pen. The pattern was unmistakable. Every suggestion, every comment, every piece of advice had been building toward the same conclusion. I should sell my house and move to a retirement community. But it was when I reviewed my phone records that the pieces really started falling into place. 3 weeks before Tommy's birthday party, I'd received a call from a real estate agent named Patricia Wong. She'd been professional but persistent, explaining that she specialized in helping seniors transition to more manageable living situations. She mentioned that she'd gotten my name from someone who thought I might be interested in exploring my options. At the time, I'd politely declined and forgotten about it. Now I realized the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. I called Patricia back, using my most grandmotherly voice to ask how she'd gotten my information. "Oh, Mrs. Sullivan," she said warmly. "Your son contacted me. Marcus, I believe. He mentioned that you'd been struggling with home maintenance and might be interested in exploring retirement communities. He seemed very concerned about your well-being." My grip tightened on the phone. Did he ask for any specific information about my property? Well, he did ask about current market values in your neighborhood. "Just to help you understand your options," he said. He mentioned that you might not be aware of how much your property has appreciated over the years. I thanked Patricia and hung up, my mind racing. Marcus hadn't mentioned calling a real estate agent. In fact, when I'd casually brought up the call during our next conversation, he'd seemed surprised and had immediately launched into a lecture about how I needed to be careful about scam calls from people trying to take advantage of elderly homeowners. The next discovery came when I was sorting through a stack of mail I'd been meaning to file. Buried between utility bills and grocery store circulars was a letter from my insurance company about updating my homeowner's policy. It was routine correspondence, but when I called to discuss the changes, the representative mentioned something that made my stomach drop. "We do have a note here that your son called to inquire about your policy limits and coverage details," she said. Of course, we couldn't provide that information without your written authorization, but he seemed quite concerned about whether you had adequate coverage for someone your age. Marcus had called my insurance company, without telling me, to ask about my coverage limits. I spent the next week in a state of controlled paranoia, paying attention to details I'd previously overlooked. Jessica's questions about my health, which I'd interpreted as caring concern, took on a different meaning when I realized she always steered the conversation toward whether I felt safe living alone. Marcus's offers to help with my finances, which I'd seen as filial duty, became suspicious when I noticed he always asked about specific account balances and investment values. The breakthrough came during what should have been a routine family dinner at their house the following Sunday. I'd brought a casserole, green bean almondine, Marcus's childhood favorite, and settled into their pristine living room while Jessica finished preparing the rest of the meal. Their house was a monument to success, all gleaming surfaces and carefully curated art pieces that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Marcus was in his study, presumably working, though I could hear him on the phone. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but their house had an open floor plan that made privacy nearly impossible. I was reading a magazine when fragments of his conversation drifted into the living room. Market analysis shows the property should appraise for at least $8 million. My magazine slipped from my hands. My house, purchased for $37,000 in 1978, was now worth nearly $2 million. I'd known property values had increased over the years, but hearing that number spoken aloud in my son's voice made something click into place. The key is getting her to agree voluntarily. If she thinks it's her idea, there won't be any complications later. I felt like I was listening to my life being dissected by strangers, except one of the strangers was my own son. I strained to hear more, my heart hammering against my ribs. Assisted living facilities in the area average about $4,000 a month for a decent place. Even with her Social Security and pension, she'd burn through her savings pretty quickly without the house sale. $4,000 a month. He'd researched assisted living costs. He knew exactly how much my pension was. He'd calculated how long my savings would last. Jessica's voice joined the conversation as she entered the study with what sounded like coffee cups. Did Patricia give you the listing comparisons? 3 houses on the same street sold in the past 6 months. Average sale price was $7 million. But Mom's lot is bigger and the house has been better maintained. Patricia thinks we could list it for $9 and settle around $8. He'd said we could list it. The timing works out perfectly, Jessica continued. Mom's been talking about how tired she gets doing yard work, and after that fall last month when she was cleaning gutters, it's obvious she can't maintain the place safely anymore. I touched my hip unconsciously, remembering the minor tumble. I'd taken off the stepladder while cleaning leaves from the gutters. I'd mentioned it to Marcus only because I'd scraped my palm and Jessica had noticed the bandage. It had been nothing more than bruised pride and a small cut, but apparently they'd filed it away as evidence of my declining capabilities. Once she's settled somewhere safe, Marcus continued, we can help her manage the money properly, make sure it lasts, set up the college fund for Tommy, maybe get him into that private school we've been looking at. College fund for Tommy. Private school. They were spending my money before I'd even agreed to sell my house. The best part is, she'll think we're doing her a favor, Jessica said with a laugh that made my skin crawl. All those comments about how hard it must be to maintain such a big house, how worried we are about her safety. She's already starting to second-guess herself. A few more months of gentle pressure, and she'll probably ask us to help her find a place. Patricia said, the market's really hot right now for properties in that neighborhood. If we can get her to list by spring, we should have no problem getting asking price, maybe more if we get into a bidding war. I sat frozen in their living room, surrounded by the expensive furniture and decorative objects that my future house sale would apparently help fund. My son and daughter-in-law weren't just planning to encourage me to sell my home. They were orchestrating a campaign to manipulate me into it. Every expression of concern, every suggestion about my safety, every casual comment about retirement living had been part of a calculated strategy to get me to hand over my most valuable asset. But the conversation wasn't over. What about her other investments? Jessica asked. She must have a decent portfolio after all those years working in accounting. I've been trying to get her to show me her statements, but she's stubborn. About keeping her finances private. Old habits from managing other people's money, I guess. But I did some research based on what I know about her salary and pension contributions. She's probably sitting on another $400,000 or $500,000 in retirement accounts. Maybe more if she was smarter about investing than most people her age. $400,000 or $500,000? Try closer to $2 million, I thought grimly. If they knew the real extent of my portfolio, their scheme would probably become even more aggressive. The important thing is establishing that we're the responsible parties, Marcus continued. Getting power of attorney, making sure we're listed as beneficiaries on everything, showing a paper trail that we've been involved in her care decisions. That way, if anything happens or if she starts showing signs of dementia or something, we're already in position to handle things properly. Dementia. They were planning for my cognitive decline like it was an inevitable convenient development rather than a tragedy. Do you think she suspects anything? Jessica asked. Marcus laughed, a sound that cut through me like broken glass. Mom? She still thinks I'm the same grateful kid she put through college. She sees what she wants to see, a successful son who visits regularly and cares about her well-being. It would never occur to her that we might have our own interests in mind. She seemed a little quiet after Tommy's party, Jessica observed. I hope we weren't too obvious about the gift thing. Nah, that was perfect, actually. Shows Tommy and anyone else watching that she's losing touch, making poor choices. It all feeds into the narrative that she needs more support, more guidance. A few more incidents like that, and everyone will agree that we're just being responsible. Children. I felt sick. The humiliation at Tommy's birthday party hadn't been casual cruelty. It had been a deliberate strategy to undermine my credibility and establish their narrative that I was becoming incompetent. I still think we should speed up the timeline, Jessica said. Property values keep going up, but so do interest rates. And honestly, the sooner we get her settled somewhere appropriate, the sooner we can start planning for our future. Tommy's education, maybe that house in the Hamptons we looked at, expanding Marcus's business. They were spending my money, in their minds, dividing up assets I hadn't agreed to give them, planning a future funded by my displacement. Patience, Marcus counseled. We push too hard and she might get suspicious or dig in her heels. Better to let her think it's her idea. A few more months of gentle pressure. Maybe arrange for some situations where she feels overwhelmed or unsafe, and she'll practically beg us to help her find somewhere easier to manage. Arrange for situations where I felt unsafe. The implications of that statement sent chills down my spine. The conversation moved on to other topics. Tommy's school activities, Jessica's yoga instructor, Marcus's latest real estate deals. But I'd heard enough. I sat through dinner in a state of controlled shock, smiling and nodding while my mind processed what I'd learned. When Jessica complimented me on the casserole, I thanked her warmly. When Marcus asked about my week, I told him about my grocery, shopping, and garden work as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I now knew that my son and daughter-in-law weren't just embarrassed by their old-fashioned mother. They were actively plotting to manipulate me out of my home and my independence so they could fund their lifestyle with my assets. The drive home that night was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept replaying their conversation, looking for alternative interpretations, hoping I'd misunderstood their intentions. But there was no ambiguity in what I'd heard. They'd researched real estate values, contacted agents, calculated care costs, and developed a timeline for pressuring me to sell. They'd even planned to document their involvement in my care to establish legal standing for future decisions. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the darkness, looking at the house Frank and I had bought with such hope and pride 45 years ago. We'd scraped together every penny for the down payment, celebrated when we finally paid off the mortgage, spent countless weekends improving and maintaining every corner of the property. This wasn't just a house to me. It was the foundation of my life, the repository of my memories, the symbol of everything Frank and I had built together. And my son saw it as nothing more than a commodity to be liquidated for his benefit. That night, I went through every interaction I'd had with Marcus and Jessica over the past year, re-examining each conversation in light of what I now knew. Jessica's suggestion that I hire a cleaning service wasn't concern for my well-being. It was, an attempt to establish that I couldn't maintain my home independently. Marcus's offer to handle my banking wasn't filial duty. It was reconnaissance to assess my financial resources. Their repeated comments about my safety weren't expressions of love. They were psychological pressure designed to make me doubt my own capabilities. I realized with growing horror that they'd been implementing their strategy for months, maybe longer. Every family gathering, every phone call, every seemingly casual visit had been an opportunity to gather information, plant suggestions, and gradually undermine my confidence in my ability to live independently. But they'd made one crucial mistake in their calculations. They'd assumed I was exactly what I appeared to be, a typical elderly woman, financially, naive and emotionally dependent on their approval. They had no idea that their target had spent nearly 4 decades managing other people's money, that she'd been studying investment strategies for years, or that she was far more financially, secure than they imagined. More importantly, they didn't know that their target had overheard their entire strategy and was now fully aware of their intentions. As I prepared for bed that night, I found myself thinking about chess, a game Frank had taught me during the long winter evenings of our early marriage. The most dangerous opponent, he'd always said, was the one who could see several moves ahead while convincing you they were barely keeping up with the current play. Marcus and Jessica thought they were playing chess against someone who was still learning checkers. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. The next morning, I began my own research. If they could investigate my finances and property values, I could investigate theirs. If they could develop strategies and timelines, so could I. If they could manipulate situations to their advantage, well, I'd been managing difficult situations a lot longer than they'd been alive. But first, I needed to understand exactly how deep their deception went and whether there were other aspects of their plan I hadn't yet discovered. Because if I was going to outmaneuver them, I needed to know every piece on the board. The investigation I launched that week would reveal schemes far more elaborate than anything I'd overheard during their casual dinner conversation. And once I fully understood the scope of their betrayal, I could begin implementing a strategy that would teach them exactly why you should never underestimate a woman who's survived 7 decades by being smarter than everyone expected. 3 weeks after discovering Marcus and Jessica's dinner conversation, I thought I'd reached the depths of their deception. I was wrong. The final straw came in a way I never could have anticipated, and it involved the one person whose well-being mattered more to me than my own, Tommy. I'd been carefully documenting everything since overhearing their plan. Every phone call, every visit, every seemingly innocent suggestion got recorded in a notebook I kept hidden in my bedroom. I'd also started my own investigation into their financial situation, and what I found was enlightening. Despite their affluent lifestyle, Marcus and Jessica were living significantly beyond their means. Their mortgage on the house was larger than I'd expected. They had substantial credit card debt, and Marcus's real estate business, while successful on the surface, carried considerable overhead and risk. The expensive cars, designer clothes, and lavish entertainment weren't signs of financial security. They were symptoms of financial pressure. No wonder they were so interested in my assets. But I was still operating under the assumption that, whatever their motivations, they genuinely loved Tommy and wanted what was best for him. That assumption shattered on a cold Thursday morning in late November. I'd volunteered to pick Tommy up from school and take him to his dental appointment, since Jessica had a yoga class she couldn't miss, and Marcus was showing a property to clients. It was the kind of grandmotherly duty I'd performed countless times without question, grateful for any opportunity to spend time with my grandson. The dental appointment went smoothly, no cavities, much to Tommy's relief, and we stopped at the ice cream shop afterward to celebrate. It was our tradition, one that had started when he was 5 and lost his first tooth. We sat at our usual table by the window, sharing a sundae and talking about his latest dinosaur book, when Tommy said something that made my blood freeze. "Grandma Dot, are you really sick?" I paused, spoon halfway to my mouth. "Sick? What makes you think I'm sick, sweetheart?" Tommy fidgeted with his napkin, avoiding my eyes. "Mom and Dad were talking about it last night. They thought I was asleep, but I heard them. Dad said you might have to go to a special place where doctors can take better care of you." My heart began to pound, but I kept my voice gentle. "What exactly did you hear, Tommy?" "Mom said you've been forgetting things a lot lately, and that you might hurt yourself living alone in that big house. She said sometimes older people's brains stop working right, and they need to live somewhere safe with nurses and stuff." Tommy looked up at me with worried eyes. "Are you going to forget me, Grandma?" I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. They were telling my grandson I had dementia. They were preparing him for my removal from his life by convincing him I was becoming mentally incompetent. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, reaching across the table to take his small hands in mine. My brain is working just fine. I would never forget you. You're the most important person in my whole world. But Mom showed me this pamphlet about a place called Sunshine Manor. She said it's where you might go to live and that we could visit you on weekends. It looked really sad, Grandma. All the people in the pictures looked sad. Sunshine Manor. I knew the place. A budget-assisted living facility on the outskirts of town with a reputation for minimal care and maximum profit. The kind of place where residents were warehoused rather than cared for, where families dumped elderly relatives they didn't want to deal with anymore. They weren't just planning to pressure me into selling my house. They were planning to commit me to the cheapest care facility they could find, while pocketing the difference between my assets and the cost of my imprisonment. Tommy, I said carefully, has anyone asked you questions about me? About whether I seem confused or if I do things that worry you? He nodded reluctantly. Mom asked if you ever seemed lost, or if you repeated yourself a lot. And Dad asked if you'd ever left the stove on or forgotten to lock doors. I told them no, because you don't do any of those things, but they said I might not notice because kids don't always see grown-up problems. They were coaching my grandson to provide evidence of my incompetence. They were using a 7-year-old child as a witness in their campaign to have me declared unfit. They also said I shouldn't tell you about our conversations because it might upset you and make your condition worse, Tommy added quietly. But I don't like secrets, Grandma. And you don't seem sick to me. You're smarter than Mom and Dad about lots of things. The innocence in his voice, the pure love and trust, nearly broke my resolve to handle this situation strategically. I wanted to gather him in my arms and run away from Marcus and Jessica and their schemes. But I forced myself to think clearly. Tommy, I want you to know that it's always okay to talk to me about anything, no matter what anyone else says. And I want you to remember that I love you more than all the stars in the sky, and that will never change, no matter what happens. Can you remember that for me? I love you too, Grandma Dot. More than all the dinosaurs that ever lived. We finished our ice cream, and I drove Tommy home with a heavy heart and a mind racing with implications. They weren't just planning to steal my assets. They were planning to destroy my relationship with my grandson in the process. They were willing to traumatize a child, to make him worry about losing his grandmother, all to smooth the path for their financial scheme. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and really absorbed the full scope of what I was facing. Marcus and Jessica weren't just greedy. They were ruthless. They'd identified every vulnerability I had, my age, my living situation, my love for Tommy, and turned them into weapons against me. But in their eagerness to build their case, they'd revealed something crucial. They needed to establish a pattern of incompetence to make their plan work. They couldn't just pressure me to sell my house anymore. They needed to prove I was mentally unfit to make my own decisions. That meant they would have to escalate their tactics, create situations where I appeared confused or incapable. And that's when I realized they'd handed me an opportunity. If they were going to stage situations to make me look incompetent, I could stage situations to make them reveal their true intentions. If they were going to document my supposed decline, I could document their manipulation. If they were going to use my love for Tommy against me, I could use their greed against them. The next phase of my investigation required more sophisticated methods. I needed proof of their intentions that would stand up in court if necessary. So, I did something that would have shocked my conventional neighbors. I went shopping for surveillance equipment. The electronics store clerk, a young man named David with purple hair and multiple piercings, was surprisingly helpful when I explained I needed to monitor my home for security purposes. He set me up with a small camera system that I could access from my phone, along with a digital recorder that looked like an ordinary pen. Is this for, keeping an eye on caregivers or cleaning people? David asked as he showed me how to use the equipment. Something like that, I replied, thinking. It wasn't entirely untrue. Installing the cameras took some creativity, but my years of attention to detail served me well. I placed one in the living room bookshelf, disguised among my collection of Frank's old technical manuals. Another went in the kitchen, hidden inside a decorative tea tin on top of the refrigerator. The third was positioned in my home office, the room where I kept my financial records and important documents. I didn't have to wait long for results. The following Saturday, Marcus and Jessica arrived for their weekly visit with Tommy. I'd started this tradition months ago as a way to maintain regular contact with my grandson, but now I suspected they used these visits for reconnaissance as much as family bonding. I excused myself after lunch to take a nap, claiming I was tired, a complaint I'd been making more frequently as part of my own strategic performance. What I actually did was go to my bedroom and monitor the camera feeds from my phone. What I saw made me grateful I'd had the foresight to install the system. Within 5 minutes of my supposed nap, Jessica was in my office, photographing documents on my desk with her phone. Marcus was in the kitchen, going through my mail and examining papers I'd left on the counter. They moved with practiced efficiency, clearly having done this before. But it was what happened next that truly revealed their intentions. Jessica returned to the living room with a small bag I hadn't noticed her carrying in. From it, she removed what appeared to be several prescription pill bottles. She scattered them on my coffee table, arranging them to look carelessly abandoned. "Make sure you remember this," she said quietly to Marcus, who was now taking photos of the staged scene. "Multiple prescriptions left out in the open. Potential for dangerous interactions if she's confused about dosing." Marcus nodded, documenting the scene from several angles. "Dr. Peterson will need to see evidence of medication mismanagement for the competency evaluation." Dr. Peterson. They'd already spoken to a doctor about having me declared incompetent, but they weren't finished. Jessica pulled out a notepad and began writing what appeared to be a grocery list, but in handwriting that was deliberately shaky and disorganized. She left it on the kitchen counter next to my actual neat grocery list. "Confused writing, multiple lists for the same shopping trip," Marcus observed, photographing both lists. "Classic signs of cognitive decline." They spent another 20 minutes staging evidence of my supposed incompetence. A coffee pot left on empty burner, suggesting I'd forgotten about it and nearly caused a fire. Pieces of mail scattered on the floor near the front door, implying I'd dropped them and been too confused to pick them up. A calendar with important dates marked incorrectly, indicating I was losing track of time and appointments. Every item was carefully documented with Marcus's camera, building a portfolio of evidence that would support their claim that I was becoming dangerous to myself and others. The most chilling moment came when Tommy wandered into the living room, saw the scattered pill bottles, and asked innocently, "Why are Grandma's medicines all over the table?" "Grandma left them out, sweetie," Jessica replied smoothly. "Sometimes older people forget to put their medicines away safely. That's why we're worried about her." "But Grandma always puts everything away," Tommy protested. "She's really neat about stuff like that." "Well, people change as they get older," Marcus said, ruffling Tommy's hair. "That's why families need to help take care of each other." They were using my own grandson as a witness to their fabricated evidence, teaching him to doubt his own observations about my competence. When I emerged from my nap an hour later, the staged evidence was gone, cleaned up as efficiently as it had been arranged. The pill bottles were back in their proper place in my medicine cabinet, though I noticed Jessica had made note of which medications I was taking. The fake grocery list had been removed, leaving only my actual list. The scattered mail had been picked up and stacked neatly on my desk. To anyone else, it would have appeared that Marcus and Jessica had spent the afternoon tidying up while I rested, the actions of caring family members looking after their elderly relative. "You're looking tired, Mom," Marcus said when I joined them in the living room. "Maybe you should think about getting more help around the house. Jessica and I have been talking about it, and we're worried that you're taking on too much." "I'm fine," I replied, settling into my favorite chair. Just needed a little rest. Us? But that's what we mean, Jessica chimed in, her voice filled with practiced concern. You never used to need afternoon naps. And we've noticed you seem more forgetful lately, leaving things out that you usually put away properly. I looked around the room, noting that everything was exactly where it should be, exactly as I'd left it. I don't think I've been forgetful. What things? Marcus and Jessica exchanged a glance that I was supposed to interpret as worried communication between concerned family members. Maybe we're wrong, Marcus said with a slight shrug. But if you ever do start feeling overwhelmed, you'd tell us, right? We just want to make sure you're safe and happy. Of course, I replied, smiling warmly. You're such good children to worry about me. If they only knew how much I meant that in an entirely different way than they thought. That evening, after they'd left with Tommy, I reviewed the entire surveillance recording. The evidence of their scheme was comprehensive and damning. They'd entered my home under the pretense of a family visit and used the opportunity to stage evidence of my incompetence, document it thoroughly, and clean up afterward to avoid detection. But more than that, I now knew they'd already consulted with a doctor about having me declared mentally unfit. The competency evaluation Marcus had mentioned wasn't a hypothetical future step. It was something they were actively pursuing. I spent that night researching Dr. Peterson and discovered he had a troubling reputation for rubber-stamping competency evaluations for families seeking to gain control over elderly relatives' assets. Several online reviews from family members complained that he'd declared their loved ones incompetent based on minimal examination and questionable evidence. The pieces of their plan were becoming clear. Stage evidence of my decline, documented extensively, have me evaluated by a doctor known for declaring elderly patients incompetent, gain legal control over my person and assets, commit me to the cheapest care facility possible, and live comfortably on my money while visiting me occasionally to maintain appearances. It was a comprehensive plan, carefully researched and systematically implemented. If I were actually the confused, isolated, elderly woman they believed me to be, it probably would have worked perfectly. But I wasn't confused, and I wasn't isolated. I was a woman who'd spent decades managing complex financial situations, and I'd been documenting their every move with the same meticulous attention to detail I'd once applied to corporate audits. They thought they were playing chess against someone who didn't even know the rules. They were about to discover they'd been playing against someone who'd been planning her endgame since the moment she'd overheard their dinner conversation. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to my attorney, a sharp woman named Caroline Mitchell who'd handled Frank's estate and my own legal affairs for years. The second was to my investment advisor, confirming certain arrangements I'd been considering. The third was to a private investigator named Robert Hayes, whose services I'd decided I needed to fully document Marcus and Jessica's activities. By the time I hung up from that last call, I was no longer just a target in their scheme. I was a player in my own right, and I had advantages they couldn't imagine. They thought they'd found the perfect victim. Instead, they'd awakened a sleeping dragon who'd been managing money and reading people longer than they'd been alive. The real game was about to begin. The transformation from victim to strategist required a complete shift in how I approached every interaction with Marcus and Jessica. While they continued their campaign to undermine my competence, I began implementing a plan that would expose their true intentions while protecting both my assets and my relationship with Tommy. My first move was establishing a secure base of operations. I opened a safety deposit box at a bank across town, where I stored copies of all surveillance recordings, financial documents, and evidence of their manipulation. I also established a new bank account they knew nothing about, transferring enough funds to maintain my independence, regardless of what they might try to do with my primary accounts. Caroline Mitchell, my attorney, was initially skeptical when I explained the situation during our consultation. A woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that had made her one of the city's most respected estate attorneys, She'd seen enough family financial disputes to know they usually involved more emotion than fact. "Dorothy, these are serious accusations," she said, leaning back in her leather chair as she reviewed my documentation. Elder financial abuse cases require substantial proof, and family members often have legitimate concerns about safety and cognitive decline. I handed her my tablet, already cued to the surveillance footage of Marcus and Jessica staging evidence in my living room. "Then let's start with this." Caroline's expression changed dramatically as she watched the recording. I could see the exact moment she realized this wasn't a case of family disagreement, but criminal fraud. "How long has this been going on?" she asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. "At least 18 months that I can document, probably longer. They've been building a case for my incompetence while positioning themselves to control my assets." "And this Dr. Peterson they mentioned?" "I've researched him. He has a pattern of declaring elderly patients incompetent based on minimal evaluation. Several complaints have been filed with the state medical board, but nothing's stuck." Caroline was already taking notes, her legal mind processing the implications. "We need to be very careful about how we proceed. If they're planning to have you declared incompetent, they might accelerate their timeline if they suspect you're aware of their scheme. That's why I need to stay ahead of them. I want to transfer all my assets into a trust structure that would make their plan impossible to execute, but I need to do it in a way that doesn't alert them to what I'm doing. That's definitely possible, but it will require some creative legal work. Are you prepared for this to potentially destroy your relationship with your son?" I thought about Tommy, about the confusion and hurt in his voice when he'd asked if I was really sick. "Caroline, they've already destroyed any real relationship we had. Now I'm just trying to protect what matters most." The trust structure Caroline designed was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than maintaining my assets in easily accessible individual accounts, everything would be placed in an irrevocable trust with specific conditions for distribution. I would retain complete control during my lifetime, but the assets couldn't be accessed by anyone else even if I were declared incompetent. More importantly, the trust included provisions for Tommy's education and well-being that Marcus and Jessica couldn't touch, regardless of their legal maneuvering. While Caroline worked on the legal framework, I turned my attention to gathering more evidence of their scheme. The private investigator I'd hired, Robert Hayes, was a former police detective who specialized in white-collar crime. A man in his early 60s with the kind of unremarkable appearance that made him invisible in most situations. He'd spent 30 years learning how to document criminal behavior without being detected. "The key to cases like this," Robert explained, "during our initial meeting, is establishing pattern and intent. Your surveillance footage is excellent, but we need to show this is part of a larger scheme, not just isolated incidents. What do you need from me?" "Keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Don't change your behavior in any way that might alert them. Continue to appear vulnerable and isolated while we document their activities. I'll handle surveillance from outside your home and investigate their financial situation more thoroughly." "How long will this take?" "Depends on how aggressive they get. If they're planning a competency evaluation soon, they'll need to create more evidence of your decline. That's when they'll expose themselves most clearly." Robert's investigation revealed the full scope of their financial desperation. Marcus's real estate business was leveraged to the breaking point, with several properties in foreclosure and significant business loans coming due. Jessica's credit cards were maxed out, and they'd already borrowed against Marcus's 401k to maintain their lifestyle. They weren't just opportunistically greedy, they were financially desperate. My assets weren't a convenience for them, they were a necessity. But the most disturbing discovery came when Robert followed them to a meeting with Dr. Peterson. Using a high-powered telephoto lens, he photographed them in the doctor's office reviewing what appeared to be a competency evaluation form. "Doctor, Peterson was already preparing to declare me mentally unfit based solely on Marcus and Jessica's reports. without ever having examined me. "This is highly irregular," Robert told me as he showed me the photographs. "Competency evaluations require direct examination and multiple assessments. What they're doing is essentially paying for a predetermined conclusion. How much time do we have?" "Based on what I observed, they're planning to schedule your evaluation within the next few weeks. They want to move quickly, probably because they're concerned about their financial situation becoming public." The timeline was accelerating faster than I'd anticipated. I needed to complete my countermeasures before they could spring their trap. The next phase required the most delicate performance of my life. I needed to appear increasingly confused and vulnerable while actually preparing for total war. I started by implementing small changes in my behavior during their visits. Mistakes that would seem like cognitive decline but were actually carefully planned misdirection. I would occasionally call Marcus by his father's name, then seem confused about the error. I'd ask about events we'd recently discussed as if I'd forgotten them entirely. The surveillance cameras I'd installed captured everything. Marcus and Jessica's visits became increasingly frequent, and with each one, they grew bolder in their manipulation tactics. They would arrive with prepared scenarios designed to make me appear confused or incapable, then document my supposed failures with their phones. During one particularly elaborate setup, Jessica brought a complex medication organizer and insisted on helping me sort my pills. She deliberately mixed up the compartments, then photographed the evidence of my inability to manage my medications properly. When I quietly corrected the arrangement after she thought I wasn't looking, she became flustered and had to restage the entire scene. I played my part perfectly, thanking her for her help while appearing bewildered by the organizer's complexity. But every moment was being recorded by my hidden cameras, creating a comprehensive record of their fraud. The most revealing incident occurred when Marcus brought a stack of financial documents he claimed needed my signature. The papers were legitimate bank forms, but he'd deliberately made them confusing by presenting them out of order and explaining them incorrectly. "These are just routine updates to your accounts, Mom," he said, spreading the papers across my kitchen table. "Sign here and initial this page." I pretended to struggle with reading the documents, squinting at the text and asking repetitive questions about what I was signing. Marcus grew impatient, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. "Just sign them, Mom. I've reviewed everything and it's all standard paperwork. You trust me, don't you?" Hidden among the legitimate forms were 2 documents that would have given Marcus power of attorney over my finances and authorized him to make medical decisions on my behalf. If I'd actually signed them in my confused state, he could have immediately moved forward with his plan to declare me incompetent and seize control of my assets. Instead, I signed only the harmless documents while pretending to miss the important ones, claiming my hand was too shaky to write clearly. Marcus left frustrated, having failed to obtain the authorization he needed. But I knew he'd be back with a different strategy. The breakthrough came when Robert's investigation uncovered communications between Marcus and a company called Senior Transitions, a service that specialized in helping families move elderly relatives into care facilities. The emails Robert intercepted revealed the full scope of their timeline. Marcus had already toured 3 different assisted living facilities, comparing costs and amenities. He'd settled on Sunshine Manor, the budget facility Tommy had mentioned, specifically because it was the cheapest option that would still appear respectable to outsiders. The difference between my actual care needs and the cost of warehouse-style assisted living would leave them with substantial monthly income from my assets. Even more damning, the emails showed Marcus negotiating with Sunshine Manor's administrators about admission procedures for residents with cognitive challenges. He'd specifically asked about their policies for residents whose families had legal authority to make decisions for them. They weren't just planning to steal my money and my home. They were planning to imprison me in a facility where I'd have no control over my daily life, my medical care, or my contact with the outside world. The final piece of evidence came when Jessica made a crucial mistake during one of their visits. She thought I was napping in my bedroom, but I was actually monitoring their activities from my surveillance app. She called someone on her phone, speaking quietly but not quietly enough to avoid my hidden microphones. Dr. Peterson says he needs at least 3 documented incidents of dangerous behavior before he can recommend immediate commitment, Jessica said into the phone. We've got the medication thing and the financial confusion, but we need something that shows she's a danger to herself or others. There was a pause while she listened to the person on the other end. I know, but we can't wait much longer. Marcus's business loan comes due next month, and if we don't have access to her money by then, we're going to lose everything. Another pause. Yeah, I think we're going to have to create a situation. Maybe something with the stove or a fall. Nothing that would actually hurt her, but something dramatic enough that we can call 911 and get it documented. Create a situation. They were planning to stage an emergency that would provide the final evidence needed for Dr. Peterson's evaluation. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized how close I'd come to becoming a victim of their desperation. If I hadn't discovered their plan, if I hadn't been recording their activities, I could have found myself committed to Sunshine Manor based on fabricated evidence of my incompetence. But knowing their intentions gave me the advantage I needed to turn their strategy against them. The next morning, I called Caroline with an update on the situation. They're planning to stage some kind of emergency to create evidence of dangerous behavior. We need to be ready to move quickly. How quickly? They mentioned a business loan due next month. I'd guess they'll try something within the next 2 weeks. The trust documents are ready for signing, and I've prepared all the necessary paperwork to expose their fraud if they try to proceed with the competency evaluation. But Dorothy, once we reveal what we know, there's no going back. Are you absolutely certain this is how you want to handle things? I thought about Tommy, about the worry in his voice when he'd asked if I was really sick. I thought about the years I'd spent working double shifts to put Marcus through college, the sacrifices Frank and I had made to give our son every opportunity. I thought about the home Frank and I had built together, and the independence I'd fought so hard to maintain after his death. Caroline, they made their choice when they decided to treat me like a commodity instead of a human being. Now I'm making mine. Then let's spring our own trap. The plan Caroline and I developed was elegantly simple. Instead of waiting for Marcus and Jessica to stage their emergency, we would create our own situation that would force them to reveal their true intentions in a way that couldn't be denied or explained away. I would have a minor but concerning health episode during one of their visits, something that would trigger their emergency protocol, but wasn't actually dangerous. While they dealt with what they thought was their opportunity to prove my incompetence, Caroline would be recording everything from a hidden location in my house. The setup required careful timing and precise execution. I arranged for Marcus and Jessica to visit on a Saturday afternoon when Tommy was at a friend's house, ensuring he wouldn't be traumatized by what was about to happen. I took acting lessons from YouTube videos, practicing how to simulate the symptoms of a minor stroke or heart episode convincingly. Most importantly, I prepared a complete dossier of evidence that would be delivered to the appropriate authorities the moment Marcus and Jessica revealed their true intentions. Saturday arrived with overcast skies and a crisp November wind that rattled the windows of my house. Marcus and Jessica arrived promptly at 2 o'clock, bringing flowers and cheerful conversation that felt like a mockery given what I now knew about their plans. Caroline was already hidden in my home office, positioned where she could monitor both the surveillance feeds and record additional evidence with professional equipment. Robert was stationed outside with cameras trained on the house, ready to document anyone who might be called to the scene. We'd rehearsed every aspect of the plan, but as I sat in my living room making small talk with my son and daughter-in-law, I felt the weight of what I was about to do. After today, there would be no pretending we were a normal family. The masks would be off, and the reality of their betrayal would be undeniable. "You seem tired today, Mom," Marcus observed, studying my face with what appeared to be genuine concern, but which I now recognized as assessment. "I am a little tired," I admitted, setting the stage for what was to come. I've been having some chest tightness lately, probably just stress. Jessica immediately perked up with interest. Chest tightness? That could be serious at your age. Have you seen a doctor? Oh, it's probably nothing, I said dismissively, exactly as a stubborn elderly person might respond to family concern. For the next hour, I gradually escalated my performance. I complained of feeling dizzy, mentioned that my left arm felt tingly, and clutched my chest occasionally as if experiencing mild discomfort. Marcus and Jessica exchanged increasingly excited glances, clearly recognizing this as the opportunity they'd been waiting for. When I finally slumped forward in my chair and gasped that I couldn't catch my breath, their response was immediate and revealing. Instead of calling 911 first, Jessica grabbed her phone and started recording me. Dorothy, can you tell me what day it is? She asked loudly, as if I were deaf rather than having a medical emergency. Are you confused about where you are? Marcus added, also speaking unnaturally loudly for the recording. Do you remember what we were talking about? They spent precious seconds documenting my supposed confusion and disorientation before Marcus finally called 911. But even then, his description of the situation was calculated to support their narrative. My elderly mother is having some kind of episode, he told the dispatcher. She's been increasingly confused lately, and now she's complaining of chest pain and seems disoriented. We've been worried about her living alone, and this kind of proves our point that she needs more care. Jessica continued recording throughout the call, coaching me to repeat concerning statements like, I don't know where I am, and I can't remember what happened. When the paramedics arrived, Marcus immediately positioned himself as the responsible family member who'd been managing my care. She's been declining cognitively for months, he told them. We've been trying to get her to move to assisted living, but she's been resistant. This is exactly the kind of thing we were worried about. Has she seen a doctor about the cognitive issues? One of the paramedics asked. We have an appointment. Scheduled with a specialist, Jessica chimed in. Dr. Peterson, he's supposed to do a competency evaluation next week. The paramedics ran their tests and quickly determined that my vital signs were stable and I wasn't having a cardiac event. But Marcus and Jessica continued to emphasize my confusion and disorientation, painting a picture of an elderly woman who was becoming dangerous to herself. She probably forgot to take her medications again, Marcus told the paramedics. Or maybe took too many. She gets confused about pills sometimes. As they prepared to transport me to the hospital for observation, I watched Marcus and Jessica exchange satisfied looks. They thought their plan was finally coming together, that this medical emergency would provide the final evidence they needed to proceed with Dr. Peterson's evaluation. They had no idea that Caroline was recording every word from her hidden position, or that Robert was photographing their pleased expressions from his position outside the house. At the hospital, I continued my performance just long enough to be admitted for overnight observation. The medical staff quickly confirmed I hadn't suffered any serious health episode, but the documentation of my supposed confusion and the family's concerns about my cognitive decline were now part of my official medical record. Marcus and Jessica left the hospital that evening convinced they'd achieved their objective. They'd documented a medical emergency that appeared to confirm their claims about my declining mental state, and they had hospital records to support their version of events. What they didn't know was that while they were congratulating themselves on their success, Caroline was already preparing to file formal complaints with the State Attorney General's office, the Medical Board, and the Adult Protective Services Division. The trap had been sprung, but not in the way they expected. The next morning, while I was still in the hospital maintaining my confused elderly patient act for the medical staff, Caroline arrived with Robert and a representative from the district attorney's office. She carried a briefcase full of evidence that would destroy Marcus and Jessica's scheme and expose them for what they really were. Mrs. Sullivan, the DA representative said, settling into the chair beside my hospital bed. We've reviewed the evidence your attorney provided, and we have some very serious concerns about what appears to be an ongoing elder abuse situation. I let the confused expression fade from my face and sat up straighter in the hospital bed. I've been hoping someone would say that. For the next 2 hours, I walked them through every aspect of Marcus and Jessica's plan, supported by recordings, photographs, and documented evidence of their fraud. The surveillance footage of them staging evidence in my home was particularly damning, as were the recordings of their conversations about medication mismanagement and planned accidents. The most serious charge will be conspiracy to commit elder abuse with intent to defraud, the DA representative explained. The amount of money involved pushes this into felony territory, and the systematic nature of their scheme suggests premeditation. What about Dr. Peterson? I asked. We've already contacted the medical board about his involvement. Providing fraudulent competency evaluations in exchange for payment is a serious violation of medical ethics and potentially criminal. As they prepared to leave, Caroline handed me a document I'd been waiting to see. The trust is fully executed and legally binding. Even if Marcus and Jessica had succeeded in having you declared incompetent, they wouldn't have been able to access your assets. And Tommy? His education fund is completely protected, along with provisions for his care if anything happens to his parents. No matter how this situation resolves, your grandson's future is secure. That afternoon, Marcus and Jessica arrived at the hospital for what they thought would be a follow-up visit with their confused, vulnerable mother. Instead, they found me sitting up in bed, fully alert, with Caroline at my side and 2 detectives, waiting in the hallway. The look of shock on their faces when they realized their scheme had been discovered was worth every moment of stress and fear I'd endured over the past months. Marcus recovered first, his salesman's instincts kicking in as he tried to control the narrative. Mom? What's going on? Are you feeling better? You seemed so confused yesterday. I was never confused, Marcus, I said quietly. I was just giving you enough rope to hang yourselves with. Jessica went pale as the implications sank in. What do you mean? Dorothy, you've been showing signs of dementia for months. We have it documented. You have fraud documented, Caroline interjected, opening her briefcase and placing a stack of photos on the hospital bed. These show you staging evidence in Mrs. Sullivan's home, creating fake documentation of her incompetence, and discussing your plans to commit her to a facility so you could access her assets. The photos spread across the white hospital sheets like evidence in a crime scene, which, I realized, was exactly what they were. Marcus picked up one of the surveillance photos showing him photographing the pill bottles Jessica had scattered on my coffee table. His hand was shaking as he stared at the image. We were trying to help her, he said weakly. She's been declining, and we were worried about her safety. Is that why you contacted real estate agents to assess the value of her property? Caroline asked, producing printouts of Patricia Wong's communications. Or why you researched the cheapest assisted living facilities in the area? We were just exploring options, Jessica said, but her voice lacked conviction. You were committing elder fraud, one of the detectives said, stepping into the room. And now you're under arrest. As they read Marcus and Jessica their rights, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and profound sadness. This was my son, the baby I'd held in my arms, the child I'd sacrificed for, the young man I'd put through college. And he'd been willing to destroy my life for money. But as the handcuffs clicked closed around his wrists, I also felt something I hadn't experienced in months, complete and total control over my own life. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. The evidence Caroline and I had gathered was so comprehensive that Marcus and Jessica's attorney advised them to accept a plea bargain rather than face trial. They pled guilty to conspiracy to commit elder abuse and fraud, receiving sentences that included restitution, community service, and probation. Dr. Peterson's medical license was suspended pending a full investigation, and several other families, came forward with similar stories of fraudulent competency evaluations. But the most important outcome was the conversation I had with Tommy after his parents' arrest. He came to stay with me while Marcus and Jessica dealt with their legal problems, and on his first evening back in my house, he climbed into my lap, with the serious expression he wore when trying to understand complicated adult situations. "Grandma Dot, Mom and Dad said you were sick, but you're not really sick, are you?" "No, sweetheart. My brain works just fine, and I'm not going to forget you or anyone else." "But why did they say you were sick?" I chose my words carefully, wanting to be honest without destroying his relationship with his parents entirely. Sometimes grown-ups make very bad choices when they're scared or worried about money. Your mom and dad made some very bad choices, and now they have to face the consequences. Are they going to jail? No, but they're going to have to do community service and pay back money they tried to take from me. And they're going to have to learn better ways to handle their problems. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the seriousness that had always made him seem older than his years. "I'm glad you're not really sick," he finally said. "And I'm glad you're not going to that sad place with all the sad people." "I'm not going anywhere, Tommy. This is my home, and you'll always be welcome here." As winter turned to spring, life settled into a new rhythm. Tommy visited me every weekend, and we resumed our traditions of cooking together, exploring local museums and working in the garden. The geology kit that had started this whole ordeal became his favorite possession, and we spent hours searching for interesting rocks and minerals in the creek behind my house. Marcus and Jessica's house went into foreclosure, as I'd expected. It would without access to my assets. They moved into a small apartment across town and began the long process of rebuilding their financial lives without the windfall they'd planned to steal from me. I allowed them supervised visits with Tommy, but our family dynamic had changed permanently. The trust that had been broken couldn't be repaired, and I had no interest in pretending otherwise. But perhaps the most unexpected development was the friendship that grew between Caroline and me. What had started as a professional relationship evolved into genuine companionship as we discovered shared interests in gardening, travel, and financial planning. "You know," Caroline said one afternoon as we sat on my porch drinking iced tea and watching Tommy play in the yard, "I've handled a lot of elder abuse cases over the years, but I've never seen anyone turn the tables on their abusers quite as thoroughly as you did." "I spent 40 years managing other people's money and watching for fraud," I replied. "Marcus and Jessica made the mistake of underestimating their target. What's next for you? Now that you've secured your independence and Tommy's future, what do you want to do with the rest of your life?" I looked out at the garden Frank and I had planted together, at the house we'd filled with love and memories, at my grandson who was carefully examining a rock he'd found with his magnifying glass. "I want to live," I said simply. "For the first time in years, I want to make choices based on what makes me happy rather than what other people expect from me." "Any specific plans?" "Actually, yes. I've been thinking about starting a consulting business. There are a lot of elderly people who could benefit from financial literacy education and fraud prevention services. Tommy's college fund is secure. My own retirement is comfortable, and I have skills that could help other people avoid what I went through." Caroline smiled. "Dorothy Sullivan, financial detective. I like it." As the sun set behind the trees that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. A year ago, I'd been a lonely widow whose son saw her as a burden and a resource to be exploited. Now I was a strong, independent woman with a secure future and a renewed sense of purpose. The geology kit still sat on my coffee table, a reminder of how this whole adventure had started. Sometimes the most valuable discoveries come from looking beneath the surface of things that appear ordinary. I'd learned that lesson about rocks and minerals, about financial schemes, and about my own capabilities. At 73 years old, I was finally ready to start the next chapter of my life. And this time, I'd be writing it entirely on my own terms. Part 5. The power reversal. 6 months after Marcus and Jessica's arrests, I received an unexpected phone call that would bring our story full circle in a way I never could have anticipated. It was a Tuesday morning in early June, and I was in my garden planting tomatoes with Tommy when my phone rang. "Mrs. Sullivan, this is Patricia Wong from Riverside Realty. I hope you remember me." I certainly did remember Patricia, the real estate agent Marcus had contacted about selling my house. "What can I do for you, Patricia?" "Well, this is a bit awkward, but I wanted to reach out because there's been an interesting development. Your son and daughter-in-law's house is being foreclosed on, as I'm sure you know, and it's about to go to auction. The thing is, it's likely to sell for significantly less than what they owe on it, which would leave them with substantial debt even after losing the property." I wasn't sure why Patricia thought this information would interest me, given that Marcus and Jessica had tried to manipulate me through her contacts with them. "I'm calling," Patricia continued, "because I've been authorized by the bank to reach out to immediate family members to see if anyone might be interested in purchasing the property before it goes to auction. It would allow the current owners to avoid some of the financial penalties of foreclosure." The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Marcus and Jessica, who had planned to force me to sell my home so they could profit from it, were now facing the loss of their own home and hoping I might bail them out. "How much would the bank accept for an immediate sale?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer would be telling. "They're asking $1.2 million, which is about $300,000 less than the current market value. It would be a good investment property for someone with the cash to purchase it outright." $2 million, almost exactly the amount they'd expected to steal from me when they forced me into assisted living. "That's an interesting proposition, Patricia. Let me think about it and get back to you." After hanging up, I sat in my garden contemplating this unexpected turn of events. Tommy was carefully watering the newly planted tomato seedlings, humming to himself as he worked. The sight of him, healthy and happy and completely unaware of the adult complications swirling around him, reminded me of what was truly important. That evening, I called Caroline to discuss the situation. "They want you to buy their house?" Caroline's voice carried a mixture of disbelief and amusement. "The house they were planning to buy with money stolen from you?" "It appears so. The bank is motivated to sell quickly, and Patricia seems to think I'd be doing them a favor by preventing a foreclosure." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about Tommy's future. Marcus and Jessica made terrible choices, but they're still his parents. If they lose their house to foreclosure and end up with massive debt, it affects his stability and well-being." "Dorothy, you don't owe them anything, after what they tried to do to you." "I don't owe them anything," I agreed, "but I might owe something to my grandson." The next morning, I called Marcus directly. It was the first time we'd spoken since his arrest, and I could hear the tension in his voice when he answered the phone. "Hello, Mom." "Marcus, I understand your house is going into foreclosure." There was a long pause before he responded. "Yeah, we're losing everything." "Patricia Wong called me yesterday. The bank is looking for a quick sale before the auction." Another pause, longer this time. "She mentioned she might contact you, but I told her not to bother. I know we're the last people you'd want to help after." "Everything." "You're right about that, but I'm not calling to help you. I'm calling because of Tommy." "What about Tommy?" "He needs stability, Marcus. He needs a home and parents who aren't drowning in debt and stress. If your house goes to foreclosure, you'll owe hundreds of thousands of dollars you don't have, and that kind of financial pressure destroys families." "So, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I might be willing to purchase your house before the foreclosure, but not as a gift. As a business arrangement with very specific terms." Marcus was quiet for so long I thought the call had been disconnected. "What kind of terms?" he finally asked. "Come to my house tomorrow evening. Bring Jessica. We'll discuss it then." The next evening, Marcus and Jessica sat in my living room for the first time since their arrest. The dynamic was completely different from our previous encounters, where they had once been confident and manipulative. They now appeared subdued and wary. Where I had once performed the role of confused elderly victim, I now sat with complete authority in my own home. Caroline was present as my legal counsel, along with Robert Hayes, whose investigation had been instrumental in exposing their fraud. The coffee table between us held a stack of documents that would define our future relationship. "Here's what I'm prepared to offer," I began, handing Marcus a folder. "I will purchase your house for $2 million, which will cover your mortgage and prevent foreclosure. However, the purchase comes with conditions." Marcus opened the folder and began reading, his expression growing more serious with each page. "You and Jessica will sign agreements acknowledging your attempted fraud and accepting responsibility for your actions. You will also agree to specific terms regarding Tommy's care and your future financial decisions." "What kind of terms?" Jessica asked, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. Caroline handed her a second folder. "Mrs. Sullivan will maintain a trust fund for Tommy's education and well-being. You will have no access to these funds, but they will ensure Tommy's needs are met regardless of your financial situation. Additionally, any major financial decisions affecting Tommy's welfare must be approved by Mrs. Sullivan or her designated representative." "You're asking us to give up parental authority," Marcus said. "I'm asking you to acknowledge that your judgment regarding financial matters has been compromised," I replied. "You attempted to defraud me of nearly $2 million. You staged evidence of my incompetence. You planned to have me committed to a substandard care facility. Those actions demonstrate that you cannot be trusted with important decisions, affecting the people you claim to love." The room was silent except for the ticking of Frank's old grandfather clock in the corner. "The alternative," Robert added, "is that you lose your house, face massive debt, and likely end up in bankruptcy while still being monitored by the court system due to your criminal convictions." Jessica looked at Marcus, and I could see them, communicating silently, weighing their limited options. "If we agree to these terms," Marcus asked, "what happens to our relationship? Do we get to see Tommy? Do you plan to try to take custody?" "Tommy needs his parents," I said. "But he also needs those parents to be honest, stable, and focused on his well-being rather than their own financial gain. If you can demonstrate that you've learned from your mistakes and are genuinely committed to putting his needs first, then we can build a functional co-parenting arrangement. And if we can't demonstrate that, then the trust fund will ensure Tommy has what he needs, and the court system will determine appropriate custody arrangements." It took them 3 days to make their decision, but ultimately they signed the agreements. The house purchase went through smoothly, and Marcus and Jessica were able to avoid foreclosure and the massive debt that would have followed. But the most significant change was in how we related to each other as a family. The power dynamic had shifted completely and permanently. Marcus and Jessica were no longer the successful couple condescending to their embarrassing elderly relative. They were convicted fraudsters who had been caught in a comprehensive scheme and were now dependent on my goodwill for their continued stability. I was no longer the lonely widow vulnerable to manipulation. I was the family matriarch with complete control over significant resources and the wisdom to use that control strategically. The first test of our new arrangement came 2 months later when Tommy started 2nd grade. Marcus and Jessica wanted to enroll him in an expensive private school, partially funded by money they no longer had. "The public school in our district is perfectly adequate," I told them during our weekly family meeting. "Tommy is a bright child who will excel wherever he's challenged appropriately. Spending $40,000 a year on elementary school tuition when you're still recovering financially makes no sense." "But the private school has smaller class sizes and better programs," Jessica argued. "The private school has prestige that you want to maintain. Tommy's education fund will cover college and graduate school, but elementary education is your responsibility. Make choices you can actually afford." It was a small decision in many ways, but it established the pattern for how our family would function going forward. I wasn't interested in micromanaging their daily lives, but I would intervene when their choices affected Tommy's long-term well-being or demonstrated the same poor judgment that had led to their criminal behavior. As fall approached, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I decided to take Tommy on a trip to Washington, D.C., something I'd been wanting to do for years but had never prioritized while I was still playing the role of grateful grandmother. "A trip to D.C.?" Marcus asked when I announced my plans. "Isn't that a lot of travel for someone your age?" I looked at him with the kind of steady gaze that had once made junior accountants reconsider their expense reports. "Marcus, I'm 73 years old, not 93. I'm perfectly capable of taking my grandson on an educational vacation." "I didn't mean—" "You meant exactly what you said. You're still thinking of me as the confused, frail woman you were trying to manipulate 6 months ago. That woman never existed. I've been managing complex situations longer than you've been alive, and I'm quite capable of handling airline tickets and hotel reservations." The trip was magical. Tommy and I explored the Smithsonian museums, took tours of the Capitol and the White House, and spent hours at the Museum of Natural History examining the mineral and geology exhibits that had become his passion. Watching his excitement as he learned about plate tectonics and crystalline structures reminded me why I'd chosen that geology kit in the first place. On our last evening in D.C., as we sat in our hotel room reviewing the day's adventures, Tommy asked me a question that revealed how much he'd grown over the past months. "Grandma Dot, are you rich?" I considered how to answer that honestly without creating unrealistic expectations. "I'm financially secure, sweetheart. I have enough money to take care of myself and help with your education and other important needs." "Is that why Mom and Dad were acting so weird before? Because they wanted your money?" Children see more than adults give them credit for. Your parents made some bad choices because they were worried about money. Sometimes when people are scared, they don't think clearly about right and wrong. But they're not scared anymore? They're learning better ways to handle their problems, and you don't need to worry about any of it. Your job is to be a kid and learn about rocks and dinosaurs and whatever else interests you." Tommy nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Can we go to the Air and Space Museum again tomorrow before we fly home?" "Of course we can." As I tucked him into bed that night, I realized that somewhere in the process of protecting myself from Marcus and Jessica's scheme, I'd also reclaimed the joy of being a grandmother. For years, I'd been so focused on being grateful for whatever scraps of attention they gave me that I'd forgotten I had the right to create my own relationship with Tommy. Now, instead of waiting for permission to be part of his life, I was actively shaping his experiences and education. Instead of accepting whatever role they assigned to me, I was defining my own position in his world. The flight home was smooth, and Tommy chattered excitedly about everything we'd seen and learned. As we descended into our home airport, he looked out the window at the familiar landscape and said, "I'm glad we live here, Grandma. It's nice to travel, but it's good to come home too." Home. That was exactly what my house had become again. Not just a building I happened to live in while waiting for other people to make decisions about my future, but a true home where I belonged and where I made the rules. Marcus and Jessica were waiting at the airport to pick up Tommy, and I could see in their faces that our trip had unsettled them. They'd grown comfortable with the new power dynamic in our family, but seeing Tommy and me return from an adventure they hadn't planned or controlled reminded them that their influence over his life was no longer absolute. "How was D.C.?" Jessica asked as Tommy regaled them with stories about the dinosaur fossils and space shuttles. "Educational," I replied simply. "We covered a lot of ground." "We need to talk about future trips," Marcus said quietly as Tommy ran ahead to the baggage claim. "Maybe discuss them beforehand so we can all be on the same page." "Marcus, Tommy is my grandson, and I'm perfectly capable of planning appropriate activities with him. If you have concerns about his safety or well-being, we can discuss those. But I'm not asking permission to take my grandson on educational vacations. It was a small confrontation, but it established an important principle. I wasn't their elderly relative to be managed and contained. I was Tommy's grandmother, with full rights to develop my own relationship with him. As we drove home from the airport, I reflected on how much had changed since that humiliating birthday party almost a year ago. Then I'd been dismissed as out of touch and irrelevant. Now I was the family's financial anchor and Tommy's educational guide. The transformation hadn't happened by accident. It had required careful planning, strategic thinking, and the courage to confront people I loved about their betrayal. But most importantly, it had required me to stop seeing myself through their eyes and start defining my own worth. That evening, after Tommy had been reunited with his parents and I was alone in my house again, I sat in Frank's old chair and opened the investment portfolio I reviewed every morning. The numbers on the screen represented more than just financial security. They represented choices and freedom and the power to shape my own destiny. Tomorrow, I would start planning our next adventure. Maybe the Grand Canyon, where Tommy could see geology in action. Maybe Yellowstone, where he could learn about volcanic activity and thermal features. Maybe Alaska, where we could explore glaciers and wildlife together. For the first time in decades, I wasn't waiting for other people to decide what my life would look like. I was making those decisions myself, based on what brought me joy and what would benefit my grandson. The geology kit that had started this entire journey still sat on my coffee table, its small hammer and magnifying glass ready for the next expedition. Sometimes the most valuable discoveries really are hidden beneath ordinary-looking surfaces. You just have to be willing to look closely enough to find them. And once you find them, you have to be brave enough to claim them for yourself. At 73 years old, I'd finally learned that lesson. And I intended to spend whatever years I had left putting it into practice while helping others discover their own hidden strengths. The game was over, but the real victory was just beginning. 2 years after the Foundation's inaugural gala, I received a phone call that would bring everything full circle in the most unexpected way possible. It was a Tuesday morning in October, and I was reviewing scholarship applications when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Mrs. Sullivan? This is Dr. Amanda Chen from the University Medical Center. I'm calling about a patient who was brought in last night and specifically requested to speak with you. My first thought was that someone from the Foundation's client base had been hospitalized, but Dr. Chen's next words stopped me cold. The patient is Dr. Richard Peterson. He's asked me to contact you because he wants to make amends for his role in what happened to your family. Dr. Peterson, the physician who had been willing to declare me incompetent without proper examination, was now lying in a hospital bed asking to see me. The irony was staggering. "What's wrong with him?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why his condition mattered to me. "He suffered a stroke 3 days ago. His prognosis is uncertain, but he's lucid and quite insistent about speaking with you. He says he has information that could help your Foundation's work." I agreed to visit, though I wasn't sure what I hoped to accomplish. Caroline offered to accompany me, but this felt like something I needed to handle alone. Dr. Peterson looked far older than his 68 years as he lay in the hospital bed, connected to monitors and IV lines. The confident physician who had been willing to rubber stamp competency evaluations for profit had been replaced by a frail man facing his own mortality. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said weakly when I entered his room, "thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either," I replied honestly, settling into the bedside chair. "What did you want to tell me?" "I've been following your Foundation's work through the news coverage. The elder abuse prevention programs, the legal assistance, the educational initiatives. It's remarkable what you've built." I waited silently for him to continue. "What your son and daughter-in-law tried to do to you wasn't the first time I'd..." been approached about providing questionable competency evaluations. There were others, Mrs. Sullivan. Many others. And I'm ashamed to say that I didn't always refuse. The weight of his confession settled between us like a physical presence. This man had participated in the systematic abuse of vulnerable elderly people, and now he was dying with the knowledge of his crimes. How many others? I asked quietly. At least 30 cases over the past 5 years. Families who wanted control over assets, nursing homes seeking to justify increased care levels, even some lawyers looking to expedite estate proceedings. I told myself I was helping families navigate difficult situations, but the truth is, I was enabling theft and abuse. I felt sick thinking about the elderly people who had been victimized because of his willingness to provide fraudulent medical opinions. Why are you telling me this now? Because you're the only person who successfully fought back. You're the only one who exposed the system and created accountability. I kept records, Mrs. Sullivan. Names, dates, financial arrangements, communications with families and facilities. I want to give you everything so your foundation can help the other victims. Dr. Peterson reached toward his bedside table with a shaking hand and retrieved a flash drive. It's all here. Every case, every payment, every fraudulent evaluation I provided. Some of the victims are still alive, still trapped in situations they never should have been placed in. I took the flash drive, feeling its weight as more than just electronic storage. This tiny device contained evidence of systematic elder abuse that could help dozens of people reclaim their lives and independence. There's something else, Dr. Peterson continued. A network of professionals who facilitate these schemes. Lawyers, care facility administrators, financial advisors, even some judges who expedite guardianship proceedings without proper oversight. They're still operating, Mrs. Sullivan, still targeting vulnerable elderly people. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Why wait until you're dying to develop a conscience? My bluntness seemed to surprise him, but he nodded as if he'd expected the question. Fear, shame, greed. I convinced myself that what I was doing wasn't really hurting anyone, that families knew what was best for their elderly relatives. It wasn't until I read about your case that I understood the full impact of what I'd been enabling. What changed your mind? The article in the newspaper quoted your grandson talking about how scared he was that you were sick and going to forget him. I realized that every evaluation I falsified represented someone's grandchild losing their grandmother or grandfather to a system designed to exploit rather than protect them. Dr. Peterson closed his eyes, exhausted by the conversation. I don't expect forgiveness, Mrs. Sullivan. I just want to try to undo some of the damage I helped cause. I left the hospital that day with the flash drive and a renewed sense of purpose. The information Dr. Peterson had provided would expand the Foundation's work far beyond what I'd originally envisioned. We weren't just helping individual families anymore. We were documenting and dismantling an entire network of elder abuse. Caroline was waiting in my living room when I returned home, along with Robert Hayes and a representative from the State Attorney General's office. Word had somehow gotten out about Dr. Peterson's confession, and law enforcement was already mobilizing to investigate the broader conspiracy he'd revealed. This is bigger than any of us realized, the AG representative said after reviewing a preliminary summary of the flash drive contents. We're looking at a systematic scheme involving multiple professionals across several states. Dr. Peterson's records could be the key to prosecuting dozens of cases and recovering millions of dollars in stolen assets. What about the victims who are still trapped in inappropriate care situations? I asked. That's where your foundation could play a crucial role. We'll need advocates to help these people navigate the legal system and reclaim their independence. Many of them have been isolated for years and don't even know they have rights. Over the next several months, the foundation transformed from a local organization focused on education and prevention into a regional powerhouse for elder rights advocacy. We hired additional staff, expanded our legal assistance programs, and created specialized units to help people escape fraudulent guardianships and inappropriate care placements. The most rewarding case involved a woman named Margaret Foster, an 81-year-old former teacher who had been declared incompetent and placed in a nursing home against her will after her nephew convinced Dr. Peterson to provide a fraudulent evaluation. Margaret had been fighting the system for 3 years, writing letters to anyone who would listen and insisting that she was perfectly capable of managing her own affairs. "Nobody believed me," Margaret told me during our first meeting at the nursing home where she'd been confined. "They said I was delusional, that I couldn't accept my limitations. But I knew something was wrong with the whole process." Margaret's nephew had gained control of her substantial estate and was systematically liquidating her assets while keeping her imprisoned in a facility that cost far less than the monthly income from her investments. It was exactly the same scheme Marcus and Jessica had planned for me, but Margaret hadn't been fortunate enough to discover it in time to prevent it. Working with our legal team, we were able to get Margaret's case reopened and the fraudulent competency evaluation overturned. Within 6 months, she was back in her own home with full control of her finances and a substantial settlement from her nephew's insurance company. "You gave me my life back," Margaret said at the ceremony where we announced her case resolution. "I was ready to die in that place, convinced that nobody cared enough to help me. Your foundation proved that someone was listening." Margaret's case became a template for helping other victims identified through Dr. Peterson's records. Each success story reinforced my conviction that the most meaningful use of my assets was protecting other people from the victimization I'd narrowly escaped. But the work also brought unexpected personal revelations. As I spent more time with elderly people who had been betrayed by their families, I began to understand just how fortunate I'd been in my ability to fight back. My financial knowledge, investment acumen, and decades of professional experience had given me advantages that most victims didn't possess. "You realize," Caroline said during one of our strategy meetings, "that what Marcus and Jessica tried to do to you was relatively sophisticated compared to most elder abuse cases. They at least went through the motions of building a case for incompetency. Most families just start taking money and hope nobody notices, which makes it even more important that we help people recognize the warning signs before things get to the criminal stage," I replied. The Foundation's educational programs expanded to include workshops for family members about healthy financial relationships with elderly relatives, training for bank employees to recognize suspicious account activity, and seminars for elderly people about protecting themselves without becoming paranoid about their family's motives. Tommy, now 10 years, old and thriving in his public school's accelerated science program, became one of our most effective ambassadors. His presentation about how my grandma turned bad guys into good guys was so popular that we created a children's version of our educational materials focused on teaching kids about financial safety and family respect. "I like telling other kids that grandparents are smart and strong," Tommy told me after one particularly successful school presentation. "Sometimes people think old people can't take care of themselves, but you proved that's not true. What do you think is the most important thing kids should know about their grandparents? That they have feelings and money and brains just like everyone else, and nobody should try to steal from them or be mean to them just because they're old." Out of the mouths of babes indeed. Marcus and Jessica's progress continued to be steady, if unremarkable. They'd completed their restitution payments ahead of schedule and had successfully transitioned off probation. More importantly, they demonstrated genuine commitment to the family counseling and financial management programs that were part of our ongoing arrangement. "I know this sounds strange," Jessica said during one of our monthly family meetings, "but I think the structure you imposed on us has actually made our marriage stronger. Having to discuss every financial decision and get approval for major purchases has forced us to communicate better. And the counseling helped us understand that our problems weren't really about money," Marcus added. "They were about feeling entitled to things we hadn't earned and expecting other people to solve our problems for us." What's different? Now? I asked. We've learned to live within our means and find satisfaction in what we can actually afford, Jessica replied. Tommy's happiness doesn't depend on expensive schools or fancy vacations. He's thriving because he feels secure and loved, not because we're trying to impress other people with our lifestyle. The transformation in their relationship with Tommy was perhaps the most encouraging development. Instead of seeing him as a tool for manipulating me or a burden on their finances, they'd learned to appreciate his unique qualities and support his interests without ulterior motives. Dad taught me how to use the rock tumbler we got for my birthday, Tommy told me excitedly after one of his weekends with his parents, and Mom is helping me organize my mineral collection by geological periods. They're actually pretty good at science stuff when they pay attention. As the foundation approached its 3rd anniversary, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected journey that had brought me to this point. What had started as a defensive response to family betrayal had evolved into a meaningful second career that gave purpose to my later years in ways I never could have anticipated. The woman who had been dismissed as too old and out of touch at a 7-year-old's birthday party was now regularly consulted by law enforcement agencies, featured in academic conferences on elder rights, and profiled in national magazines as an example of successful aging and civic engagement. But the most satisfying recognition came from an unexpected source. Tommy's school announced that he'd been selected to represent the district in the state science fair with a project about economic geology and resource protection, a sophisticated analysis of how geological surveys protect mineral rights from exploitation, directly paralleling how legal frameworks protect elderly people from financial abuse. I got the idea from watching Grandma Dot protect herself and then help other people do the same thing, Tommy explained to the local newspaper reporter covering his selection. She taught me that you have to know what you have before you can protect it, whether it's crystals in rocks or money in banks. The project won first place at the state level and earned Tommy a scholarship to a summer science program at the state university. But more importantly, it demonstrated that the lessons he'd learned from our family's crisis had shaped his understanding of justice, protection, and standing up for vulnerable people. On the evening of the Foundation's 3rd anniversary gala, I stood before an audience of 300 people, donors, volunteers, clients, and community leaders, reflecting on how much had changed since that first small event in the hotel ballroom. 3 years ago, I began, I thought my story was ending. I was a widow whose son saw her as an inconvenience and whose assets were viewed as an inheritance to be claimed, rather than resources I'd earned through decades of hard work. Tonight, I'm here to tell you that our stories don't end when other people decide we're no longer relevant. They begin again when we decide to write them ourselves. The applause was generous, but I wasn't finished. The Dorothy and Frank Sullivan Foundation has helped 87 elderly people reclaim their independence from fraudulent guardianships and abusive family situations. We've provided legal assistance to over 200 families navigating elder care decisions. We've educated thousands of community members about recognizing and preventing financial abuse. But our most important accomplishment is proving that age doesn't disqualify you from fighting back when someone tries to steal your dignity. As I looked out at the audience, I saw Margaret Foster sitting at a table with other survivors of elder abuse, all of them now living independently and advocating for others in similar situations. I saw Caroline and Robert, whose professional expertise had been essential to our success. I saw community leaders who had joined our cause, and young professionals who were building careers in elder advocacy. And at the family table in the front row, I saw Marcus, Jessica, and Tommy, 3 people whose lives had been fundamentally changed by the events that started with a geology kit and a dismissive comment about being too old. Tonight marks the end of our 3rd year, but it's also the beginning of our next chapter. We're announcing the establishment of the Tommy Sullivan Youth Advocacy Program, which will train young people to recognize and report elder abuse in their communities. Because the most powerful protection against victimization isn't legal frameworks or financial literacy, It's having someone who cares enough to pay attention and speak up. Tommy beamed from his seat as the audience applauded the program named in his honor. At 10 years old, he'd become one of our most effective advocates, visiting schools and community groups to teach other children about respecting and protecting elderly family members. After the gala ended and the guests had departed, I found myself alone in the hotel ballroom where this journey had truly begun. The decorations were being taken down, chairs were being stacked, and the remnants of the evening were being cleared away. Caroline joined me in the quiet space, both of us tired but satisfied with the evening's success. "Any regrets?" she asked, echoing a question she'd posed several times over the years. "Only one," I replied. "I regret that it took a crisis to show me what I was capable of accomplishing. I spent too many years defining myself through other people's expectations instead of pursuing my own potential. But you figured it out eventually, and you're using that knowledge to help other people discover their own strength. That's the best revenge, isn't it? Taking the worst thing that happened to you and transforming it into the best thing you ever did for other people." As we walked out of the ballroom together, I thought about the geology kit that had started everything, the simple gift that had been dismissed as outdated and irrelevant by people who couldn't see its true value. Like the rocks Tommy had learned to crack open to reveal hidden crystals, my family's crisis had broken apart our surface relationships to reveal deeper truths about strength, independence, and the power of refusing to accept other people's limitations. At 76 years old, I'd learned that the most valuable discoveries often come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes you have to be willing to break things open to find the treasures hidden inside. And sometimes the person you thought was too old to matter turns out to be exactly the person the world was waiting for. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.